Welcome to Jewish Boy Calls His Mother. I'm your host, Sadia. This is my mother, Ima, and we are finally back on track after like a 2 week hiatus of trying to figure things out. Finally, my laptop's back out of from the shop. The Zoom
Woo!
can be working. We have everything put together now. I did get a little screwed over because my original laptop was 17 inches wide, and now it's only 15 inches wide. So it
And
had,
did you pay the same money for it?
yup.
First of all, what did they tell you when you said, "Wait a minute, this one's smaller and it's the same money"? What did they say?
Sorry, Charlie.
What?
There's nothing you there's nothing you could do about it. Because the way it works is you buy a product, you get reimbursed for the money you spent on it previously, not including interest, not including inflation. So I spent maybe about like close to $800, a little over $800 last year, 2 years ago. And then the laptop I got was discontinued, and a smaller version with the same price was released like this year. And the reason for that, I was told, was because people like smaller laptops now. They don't like the two big ones. It's not portable enough.
Ooh,
So I asked them, well, maybe people want bigger. And they said if they want a bigger screen, they just buy a bigger screen and then connect it. That's it.
ooh, interesting. Makes
So
sense.
yeah, I was a little upset, but there's nothing I could do about it. I just had to take my L and move on.
And this
So
is a tendency in general, I think, to try to make electronics, like smaller too, so you can, carry them more easily.
yeah, that's what he was telling. That's
Yeah.
the gentleman that was helping me was telling me like that's the new trend now. It trends up, come and go. So like the trend beforehand was everything had to be big. Now everything has to be small. And in this, that's I just got the short end of the stick when it came to, the sizing of my computer.
Okay. Well. Yeah.
Yeah,
Gamzilla Tova.
yeah, Gamzula Taiba.
Gamzilla
Um,
Tova. Yeah.
we were also talking about your stories as a little baby, but I wanted to actually
Baby
ask a
stories.
question. I want to ask a
Yes.
question about
I was never a
Rosh
baby. I was
Hash-
born this size.
Well, two questions actually. It's a twofold question. One was Rosh Hashanah. I don't know if we've talked about it yet, like on the podcast. I'm trying to think. I know I asked you like recently. I've been asking you questions based on the holidays around the podcast. So, what do you remember of Rosh Hashanah when you were a kid?
The
Like
story with
anything
the cat.
fun? What? What did you say?
every Rosh Hashanah, I think about the story with the cat.
What story with the cat?
We did that one time on the podcast. Remember what it was? My mother had a custom. First of all, Rosh Hashanah. Erev Rosh Hashanah was when she would take us off our haircuts.
Okay.
Okay, we had short hair as kids, so she took us for a haircut. And there was this elderly lady around my neighborhood that I used to visit, who was a cat lady. She had all these kittens and cats.
Oh yes, you
So
told me that story.
yes, that's the story. So
Yeah,
whenever I think of Rosh Hashanah, I think of the
I think of the
cat.
story about the cat. What about like going to shul for davening? Do you remember any like songs you enjoyed, or was everything just too boring for you, or
No,
what?
no, they had what was called, we had our own machzorim, which was a condensed machzor for children. It was called Junior Congregation sitter, and I remember we had it in they had it in like one of the classrooms in the old Bet on Garrison Boulevard, and I remember one. It was a Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. And the woman in charge called for volunteers to stand up and to tell everybody about something they're sorry that they did and that they're not going to do anymore.
Okay. So what did you say? What did you talk about? Ema,
Okay,
your
I was a
audio.
kid. All right, so here
Yeah.
my mother um, used to well, I have this, as you know, I've always had some reason this very big taiva for raw meat.
Yeah.
And my mother would have meat defrosting on the kitchen
Hmm.
counter, and I would sneak into the kitchen and take some of the raw meat and eat it. So that
Gross.
was the thing. I said I was sorry for it. I wasn't going to do anymore.
That's what you said you weren't going to do anymore. Oh God. Oh jeez.
I think
uh,
I think I was like 8 years old, 8 or 9 years old.
8 or 9 years old. It's funny you mentioned that because you.
All I
Oh, by
know
the
is that
way,
the room got very quiet.
but by the way, something's up with your audio. Whenever it gets too loud, it shuts
Mhm.
down. So I
Oh,
can't hear you if you go above a certain decibel. I don't know why. It doesn't.
okay. So I have to kind of tone down my voice.
That kind of. I don't know. It's just something with the audio.
Was there something when I told the story? Did you get the whole story or did it
I
shut
got the whole
off?
story, but when you started laughing, and it's a funny story, unfortunately, the audio muted and I couldn't hear you. So
Okay.
something about your iPhone sensitivity is going on.
Okay.
But that's actually awesome. Um, yeah, because I'm thinking of like when I was a kid with Rosh Hashanah, and I loved Rosh Hashanah as a kid. But when I started becoming older, a lot of my friends, obviously being more mature, they had more like responsibilities, and I didn't really get it. I was still just being a wild child. And one of my friends, Shmuley Rothstein, I was speaking to him, and he wasn't talking back to me on Rosh Hashanah. And I was like, wondering, like, why aren't you talking? Like, what's your deal? I'm trying to have a conversation with you. And then he had to explain to me that on Rosh Hashanah, some people don't talk that much because they want to make sure that everything they say is important. They don't waste words on Rosh Hashanah time.
Mhm.
And when I was younger, I didn't get that. I was like, what? That's just so stupid. But now, as an adult, I'm really understanding the
Mhm.
importance of that. And so
Sure.
I'm like kind of cutting back, and I'm trying to be a little more, I guess, a little more not subtle, but like more comprehensive of the holiday spirit, so to speak. But do you remember any traditions for Rosh Hashanah when you were a kid?
Well, the thing of course, we had regular like yontif meal, but the idea of like dipping the apple in the honey, we did not do that. We did not have the fish head. I think we dipped challah in honey. That we did, but other than that, we didn't. We weren't really educated as to all the traditions of Rosh Hashanah. I mean, I went
Mhm.
to Hebrew school, and they told us about dipping the apple in honey, and I don't think they might have told us about the head of the fish. I don't know, but some people have the head of a ram. Quite honestly, I enjoy a fish head, and your
Mm,
father was always very like squeamish about this type of
yeah,
things. So for a
yeah, to say the
while,
least.
I didn't have a fish. He would chicken out. I call him chickening out by getting those little candy fish heads from 7 Mile Market.
Yeah,
And so I put up with it for a few years, and I decided, the heck with it, I'm going to, you know, either I would get a whole fish, say from Giants or something, and as long as the fish is whole, you can clean it out yourself, and it's perfectly
yeah,
kosher.
yeah. You can buy
So I
a
would
kosher
either
fish
get
from any
that,
supermarket.
right? I'd either get that, or if I was a 7 Mile Market, I would buy it. They had fish heads on sale, so I'd buy a fish head. There was one year I went to one of the kosher stores, and I come in, and oh my God, the store, all I wanted to buy was, I'd forgotten to buy a fish head before Rosh Hashanah. It was Erev Rosh Hashanah. And so I just wanted to get a fish head. I just wanted a fish head. So I come into the store, and it was so crowded. It was
Oh, for
unbelievably
sure.
crowded. And I thought, what can I do? I mean, I'm going to wait for hours, to get one lousy fish head. And I don't know if we ever told this story before, but I see one of the women who was one of the, either the manager or one of the owners, comes over to one of the workers there, and she says to him, obviously the man cannot understand English very well, and she says, Fernando, she points to this box, put the meat in the freezer, and she points to the freezer, and she points to the box, and he goes, not to sound like he understands, and I go, Fernando. I walk over and I go, perdóname, amigo, necesito comprar cabeza de pescado, and which means, excuse me, friend, I need to buy a fish head. And he says, oh, sí, sí. He says, "Se ahora, now." And he reaches in, he gets me a fish head, he hands it to me, and gracias. I go right to the counter, pay my money, and leave.
That's awesome. That is awesome. I love that. Yeah, we went to 7 Mile today. It wasn't totally crazily crowded. I mean, it was crowded for like, an Arab Shabbos kind of situation, but even for Arab Rosh Hashanah, it
Mhm.
wasn't so ridiculous as much as you'd expect. But it was really cool because they had like different simanim and they had it prepackaged because during Rosh Hashanah, there's all sorts of simanim from all over the world that people do. And like you buy these like carrots, for instance. If a family doesn't like carrots, you just want one carrot, but you have to buy a whole bag of them. No one eats them. It goes to wherever. So what what they have now is they have like a whole tray of like mini little, you know, cups of like 12, 13 different simonim, and you get
Mm,
to just pick from all of it. You don't have to worry about spending so much money on all these other things.
that's a good idea. When your friend and I were in Israel, we were in there for Rosh Hashanah, and on the table, of course, was a big, spread of all the different simonim from different minhagim, different groups. I was very surprised to see black-eyed peas and kale.
Really? I thought,
Yeah,
yeah, black eyed peas. There's also,
and kale,
um,
and kale.
Ruthie showed me something. There's a Romanian, um, Romani, sorry, Roman. That's what it was. It was a Roman tradition of this half crescent moon cake to represent some kind of segula for Rosh Hashanah. And some people were making them at home and selling them. Um,
Half cra I guess you could you have to buy a mold with that shape to make
well,
the cake.
I it was more like a cookie with like drizzle on it.
Hmm.
Um, I'm curious enough. I think I'm going to go ahead and just double check, make sure I am saying the right thing. Um, but yeah, I find it so fun because it's just like I love seeing new traditions. Here it is. It's called a mezzaluna, a half moon, is a traditional Roman Jewish cake for Rosh Hashanah. It's a personal replication of the original cake. Okay, this is just someone's explanation of the cake itself, but no real further dive into the um meaning behind it. But yeah, it was a half
Mhm.
crescent moon
Hmm.
cake for a Roman segula. Um, but
Is this from ancient Rome? Is this from ancient Rome, or it's Italian?
I think it's just Roman because
Uh-huh.
you have to remember, even like, even in the mafia, like being Sicilian was like the only thing back in the day. Like everybody had their own, I guess, tribe. So I guess with in Italy, I would think it's a more of like a Rome thing. It's not necessarily anything outside of Rome.
It's like what is it in Baltimore? Eating eating pizza the night before Pesach is a Baltimore tradition, or sukkah sukkah hopping.
Yes,
Sukkah
sukkah
hopping
hopping.
is something that's very Baltimore. They don't do it that much in other cities. They do it a
Yes.
lot in Baltimore. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I find. Yeah, that's what I find interesting.
Mhm.
Each little yeah, it's like each little city develops its own traditions. Like
Mhm.
for instance, like I know one tradition I find very interesting is with pizza and Jewish people. There's this religious concept that like right after Pesach, almost the entire American Jewish like people have to have pizza. Like that is their thing. Like they have to have pizza, and it's the funniest like happenstance. Or it's like with having sushi like at every random kosher restaurant. You know, that's always something that I find very funny. Which again, I want to go back to what I asked you before. Were there any Jewish or Rosh Hashanah traditions that you remember Baltimoreans having back in the day, or you remember them being developed or discovering them when you were becoming from?
um, not really. Um, like, no, not that not that I could really think of. Not that I could really think of. It's like, well, when I was it was in Baltimore before I became from. It was like the from community was kind of like, you might say, cloistered. You might say they very much kept to themselves.
Mm.
And like your father also went to Beth Philip for Hebrew school,
Yeah.
and we had acquaintances that were from. But your father one day said to me, he says, of the various acquaintances that we had through our lives in Baltimore, not one person invited us for Shabbos, not a
What do
single
you mean?
person. And growing up, we had, we had some from kids that went to the public school, and we had some,
Oh,
we had every now and then we would have a friend who was from a from family that we would talk to. Not really hang out that close because, like I said, they really tried to distance themselves from the people that were not from. Um, but your father said, like, growing up in Baltimore, and every now and then, like, having a from a friend or an acquaintance who was from, and your father said to me, all those years we grew up in Baltimore and we're surrounded with from people, and did little things with them, and spoke to them. Not one person ever thought to invite us for Shabbos.
it's funny because the whole idea of Frumkeit and maybe not being so cut off from non-religious Jews was a foreign concept until 1967 when the Lubavitch Rebbe started the whole tefillin campaign. And even
Hmm.
when he did it, he was yelled and
Yeah,
screamed at by a bunch of other big
yeah.
rabbanim and was told that he's being a
Hmm.
lunatic and putting tefillin on pigs. So it doesn't. So
Yes.
like I could imagine why you wouldn't be asked for a Shabbos meal in the 1960s, by your from friends, because if they did, it would
Hmm.
literally for them in their mindset, from my perspective, and all these other transactional, I don't know,
Hmm.
whatever. The ideas of they probably was like someone who wasn't even Jewish.
Yeah. So there were a few things like I remember is when the Rebbe came out with the Shabbos Candle campaign. Oh my gosh, there was a lot of controversy around it because you had mothers who were saying, well, it's not our minhag until you get married. And the Rebbe at Fabringen pointed out that actually it was the minhag for little girls to light Shabbos candles until World War One. And during World War One, there was a problem with getting a hold of wax or oil. And so families only had enough for two candles for the mother, and that would be it. And so but the Rebbe said that girls should go back to that. So I remember, oh my goodness, it was like a lot of people were very, very upset about that. They felt that the Rebbe was trying to force Chabad minhagim on everybody, which he wasn't. I remember one time I was passing out Shabbos candles on the street, and this little girl very anxiously put out her hand and wanted to have a Shabbos candle, and her father. It was from a father walking with a little from girl. He grabbed her hand away and said to me, her mother lights for her, and very quickly, like, went off with her to get her away from me. Like
Yeah,
when she, because she came over, she actually wanted a candle. Um,
yeah.
I remember one time I decided to take it on myself to try to approach the reforming conservative. So I'm going to call them so-called rabbis. They're not really rabbis; they're speech
Did
makers
they
and
get smicha?
fundraisers. But
There,
then,
even nowadays, actually, even nowadays, there are a lot of they're from guys who would just run a reform or conservative shul.
there's that these days, yeah, but so anyway, so I called some of the reformed and conservative rabbis there and asked about doing a Taras Mishpacha program with their sisterhood or whatever, and the reaction I got was, "Why don't they let us bring our converts to the mikveh in Baltimore?" So I said, "Well,
Oh, you
that's
talked about this before.
yes, right, separate." So there were some from women when I told them that what I was doing actually said to me, maybe you shouldn't do that because maybe a non-religious woman can matami the mikvah because she doesn't know how to do it properly.
Yeah, they
So
don't know what they're talking about.
so I went to Rabbi Feldman and I told Rabbi Feldman what some of these frum women had said to me. And Rabbi Feldman said, that is total nonsense. He says, you cannot matami a mikvah. He says, these women are just making up excuses like for not approaching non-religious women.
Well, I think it's also not just excuses, and especially coming up, being in the month of Elul, it's I've seen a lot of aspects of different a lot of aspects of Judaism, and one thing I can tell you is that a lot of times it's ignorance more than malice.
Sure.
And what happens a lot is that you have people who don't know halacha, but they're from because they know that they have to keep Shabbos and Kashrus and Teres Mishpacha, but they don't know what they're talking about. But then they talk like they know what they're talking about. And they say some real ignorant things that don't make any sense, or even if they do technically make sense to them, or on some level, their logic, it's not halakhically correct.
Mm-hmm.
I know this one situation, this one person who is a convert to Judaism. They left Yiddishkeit from Wise, and people were coming up and asking if that person was still Jewish. And the answer is yes. And from people that keep Shabbos and Kashrus that I thought knew halacha were asking me that question, and I'm like, that's not true. And it's just there's a lot of ignorance. And luckily, because of Chabad.org and Aish.com and other Jewish websites and people communicating, there's becoming less and less of a misunderstanding and more of like a global comprehension of minhagim. And it's becoming, I think, in my opinion, I think walls are coming down when it comes to different cultures of Judaism. You know, you could talk about the closest cultures of like Yeshivish and Hasidic, or a little more different, like uh, Sephardi and Ashkenazi and Temani and Ethiopian, things like that, where there really are like strong differences, but they're differences that help cultivate Jewish culture. And I think it's funny enough when people start feeling like it's exciting to see someone new and to see different things.
Oh, yeah. That's another thing,
That
like until fairly recently, and basically one's experience and in Yiddishkeit was basically totally Ashkenazic. You didn't have an influx yet, and this is in the 50s and 60s and the early 70s. There was not that influx of like Iranians and Taimani and Sephardi.
Well, there actually was an influx of Sephardim during the 1700s and 1600s and 1800s that were living in the South that also moved up to the North. There are big Sephardi shuls that have been around since the 1800s in America. The thing is that it hasn't been so publicized. That's really what's going on.
What about Baltimore? Because when I'm growing up in Baltimore, I never remember meeting anybody other than regular, Ashkenazic Jews in Baltimore.
Well, I don't know that much about Baltimore, but I do know that in America, I think one of the first Jewish immigrations was a Sephardic immigration. And I think there was like in like the 1600s or something like that.
I think they were Portugals. It was Portuguese Jews.
Well, the
New
first
York
group,
or Rhode Island.
Well, the first group of Sephardic Jews was in North America, was from Brazil in 1654. And then, there was Sephardic Jewish community was located in New York City, and then there was definitely Sephardic communities in Barbados, which is in 1658. So there has been plenty of stories of Sephardim. I think what it is that you have the unfortunate part is that people kind of, I guess, stick to their own, because it's hard to admit or even notice that happened in the Jewish community, but it did. But I don't know. I have to. I'm only saying this just from brief, like skimming through, you know, bits pieces of information. But from what I can tell, that there was a lot of Sephardi Yidden that were coming to America since 1654, and they're very much involved in the Jewish world, even in North America and United States of America, and
Mm.
that it was just another thing where it's like you told me that back in the day, German Jews didn't want to marry Russian Jews, and
Right.
they'd sit
Yeah.
shiva for them. So there was a lot of animosity and sinas chinam, not even like 50, 60 years ago
Mhm.
with that. And I think it's amazing how far we've come
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
with
Well, I
what.
remember reading an article in Life magazine in the 1960s, because now you were getting a lot of Sephardic and Yemenite Jews by the 1960s that were immigrating to Israel.
Mhm.
And this article was about the discrimination that the Ashkenazic Jews in Israel had against the Sephardic Jews, and how they even didn't want their children to intermarry with them. And this, our friend, my friend from Pikesville, who
Yeah.
married a Jew from Libya, and they're living in Israel. I think it was one of this old one of their neighbors, when he brought her to the house to introduce her to his family. It was his family accepted her. They thought she was wonderful and there was no problem. But one of his elderly Sephardic neighbors, or another neighbor, like may have been from Libya, came over to the house and felt it was her, was upset, and telling the family that she was there because she felt it was her duty to break this thing up, and that they're accepting a Ashkenazic, daughter-in-law into their midst. And of course, the family just kind of like let me show you the door, type thing. Yeah. But she had no problem. She had no problem with his family at all. But this just this one elderly neighbor that came over there and tried to start a little ruckus.
Do you remember your first time realizing there are Sephardi Jews?
That's a really good question. I'm trying to think back. When did I realize about? Well, other than reading this article in Life magazine, I'm trying to think when my first encounter was with a Jew that was a. I'm thinking back to college. No. High school. No. I think it was when I went to Israel.
Really?
And when I went to Israel, and I remember when I went to Israel, I was shocked to see Ethiopian Jews when I went to Israel.
Mhm.
That shocked me. I'd never met Ethiopian Jews. To actually see Black people there that were Jewish, I mean, it was just like, wow. I think when I went to Israel was my first encounter with Jews that were Sephardic or Yemenite or Ethiopian. Yeah. By the way, I wanted to go back to what you asked about Rosh Hashanah. That my sisters and I, what happened was we went to Hebrew school. We studied about Tashnech, but the actual prayer and actually what to do was not in our Siddur, in that little junior congregation Siddurim. But we only knew that on Rosh Hashanah you're supposed to go to some water. I remember in Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we used to do a lot of shul hopping during the day. So one of the things that we did was we went down to the reservoir that's around Drew Hill Park,
Mhm.
and we went down and we just walked over, and we kind of like looked at the reservoir, because we knew we were supposed to visit a body of water on Rosh Hashanah, and we didn't know what prayer to say. We just stood there looking at the water. Okay, we saw it. Let's go home now.
It's cute. Did your parents ever talk about their experience in Rosh Hashanah, or did they ever mention certain things, or your grandparents?
No, they didn't. No, they didn't talk about that. No.
They weren't. It's I find this so
Mhm.
interesting because I'm noticing more and more as I'm getting older that like our generation really does talk more about ourselves, but our lives in a good
Mhm.
way. Whereas like I remember trying to speak to Tati about something or asking a question about something or something happening, and just like no one says anything. Like there would just be like deadpan silence of nothing. And it's just like so stupid and odd. Um, that's why I'm not surprised when I ask you these questions that you don't know what's going on or you don't know at all about who said what, because people just didn't, you know? And I'd
Yeah,
be
there was
impressed. I'd
there
be
was not much.
impressed when you.
Yeah, there was not much communication. You just did these things, and there was not too much communication about it.
Yeah, that's like the dumbest thing ever. I hate that so much. It's
Well, if
so
they had,
stupid.
I can't, something, I can't blame people from another generation because
Well, I
you
get
don't know
that. No,
what
I
the
get what it
sleeper
is. I
was.
get
Yeah.
what it is. I'm not blaming the generation itself. I'm
Uh-huh.
saying the concept is stupid. What they did and how they had to handle it, I wouldn't want to go through it.
Yeah.
But it's just I look back at my experience and it just bothers me almost to no end about how little communication there was sometimes where I would say something or do something or ask a question and I would get no response.
I'm
No
sorry. I didn't know
response.
I did
It's
that.
not
I thought I
necessarily
answered
from
all your
you.
questions.
Not
Oh,
not necessarily from you,
uh-huh.
but more of like if I'd ask Tati or I'd ask my siblings or something, I just wouldn't get any response back. It would just be well, what about this? What about that? Da, 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 da. And like they would just be like silence, and then I'd just be ignored. And
Hmm.
I'd just be like, all right, whatever. I get it.
Well, so
It is
what
what it is.
questions do you want to know? You can ask me now.
Well, that's why I'm having this whole giant podcast and doing everything.
Very good.
Because it's just
So
like
we are making up
I
for lost time.
I don't hopefully it'll make up for lost time. I don't know where I don't even know where this is going to take us. But the more information, the better. Um, I wanted to actually finish off. I know not so much on a high note or a low note, but I'm trying to remember if we talked about this on a different podcast about your experience like when 9/11 happened.
Whoa, boy.
I think we talked about it.
You
I
know
think we
something? When I
did.
was a kid, they said when I was in seventh grade was when Kennedy was assassinated, and
Yeah.
the talk in my generation is that that everybody remembers where they were and what they were doing when they heard that John Kennedy was shot.
Yeah.
And so they were talking on the radio the other day about September 11th, and it's the same thing is true of September 11th. Everybody remembers what they were doing, where they were going, when they heard about the Twin Towers. And what happened was first, I remember in the morning I was driving, I was doing Beis Yaakov carpool. It was a beautiful, beautiful day, gorgeous. One of those rare days in Baltimore where it's not raining and the temperatures in the like mid 70s, and the sun is shining and it's actually comfortable.
Yeah. It was a
And I
Tuesday.
remember driving to school and thinking, this day is so beautiful. It's such a beautiful day. It's so nice. And they were saying how the news in general that day was before September 11th, that day, before that morning, the news was very quiet. That the only thing that was even worthy of mentioning was, I think was it Magic Johnson was retiring? Or was it another basketball player was retiring? I don't know, but they said there was nothing really that was newsworthy that morning. It was very quiet. It was unusually quiet as far as like news goes. And I remember, so then I dropped the girls off at school. I go back home. I remember I was sitting in the kitchen. I turn on the radio. Usually after I dropped everybody off at their carpools, it would be my turn to come home and sit and make my breakfast and drink my coffee and listen to the radio a little bit. Getting all the kids off to school with their lunches and running around and getting everybody out. And come home, and Strini was a baby. She was born 1999, so
Yeah.
she was barely she was barely two. It's about a year and a half year old. And I'm sitting. I turn on the radio, and I hear Tom Marr, who was on the radio, saying, "I guess you've all heard about the World Trade Center." And I'm thinking, so my first thought was, I remember, I think a year or two before that, there had been some terrorists that tried to set off a bomb in the basement, in the garage of the World Trade Center, and they were discovered in time. So I thought maybe somebody found another bomb, like the same thing in the garage or the basement. And I'm listening to the radio, and I'm going, is this for real? So wait a minute, is this what, like, it was like disbelief, like what in the world? Like, what? I was like, I I thought, is this really happening? I mean, are they reminiscing about something that happened before? Are they talking about a hypothetical? Are they talking about a movie? That's the whole thing. Is this really happening? And it took a while. And it was like people were confused. They didn't quite know what to do. And well, you were TA at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what happened? Like I understand that your brother Yosef told me that Rabbi Kahana called an emergency faculty meeting, all teachers to the office immediately. And so Yosef was sitting in the classroom. He was 8 years old at the time, and with one of his friends, and said, Yosef, and there's no teacher around, gets the idea, hey, let's sneak out of the room and go explore the building. No one's watching us. And Yosef said he came to the door of the classroom. He opens up the door to run out or to sneak out, and he sees policemen totally covering the hallway. And he sees this one big policeman standing right by the door of the classroom. And Yosef, your brother Yosef, when he was 8 years old, you know how he looked, little blonde, cute kid. And you just eat him up. And so Yosef looks up at this police officer, and the police officer looks down at Yosef and smiles and waves. And Yosef smiles and waves back, and then goes back into the room and closes the door. So, what was where were you? Were you in?
So
Yeah.
I've mentioned this before in the podcast. I've talked
Yeah, I
about it,
think
and
so.
that's why
Mhm.
but I remember to this day it was around like 9:15. I was in class in 8th grade in Rabbi Fuchs's class. Basically, I remember Rabbi Spiro walks in, and he's a little frantic, and he goes and in a loud whisper tells Rabbi Fuchs, my rabbi of the class, that the World Trade Center has just been hit. And Rabbi Fuchs, he's really like, what? He's like confused. And I had no idea that the Twin Towers would have called the World Trade Center. I knew there was one in Baltimore. So I
Mhm.
was like confused, as if like Baltimore World Trade Center got hit. Like I didn't know what was going on. And then they left, and then all the teachers left. So in middle school, we just got out and started walking around, and we went into Mrs. Gold's office, which was the secretary's office. And we saw on a small, like 15-inch screen, um, the World Trade Center's like on fire, and just looking at it like, and we were all just like staring for like an hour, watching the TV for like an hour. And then the rabbis were like, okay, let's go back to class. Let's go ahead and let's go back to learning. Let's go back to learning. Let's go back to class. And then, of course, school, we got out early because we weren't sure what was going on. We didn't know if any
Mhm.
Jewish schools were being targeted.
Yeah, they were
Um,
worried about that. Yeah.
and then we found out the Pentagon got hit. So it was a whole thing. But like, yeah, that was what happened. That was from my experience, and I just thinking about it more and more as like years go by. Like I feel like it was yesterday, but it's been
Yeah.
like 22 years,
Right.
I think, and it did change everything, no matter how corny that
Right.
sounds.
It did.
Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think it was right around Rosh Hashanah time.
Yeah. It was. There was. Yeah. It was because we're doing Salichos. There was a whole group of Jewish men who were late because they were late because they decided to say Salichos. They stayed in shul saying Salichos, and
Mhm.
because they were late, thank God their lives were all saved.
Yeah, it was right. It
I
was right.
remember hearing about that. Um, I just remember when I think about what a phenomenon it was. Think about it: 5 men killed, around 3,000 people within 20 minutes.
Yeah.